That afternoon, hundreds of people were crossing the square when a sharp sound cracked through the air. A police officer had just struck a black woman selling roasted corn from an old cart, all because she had not moved it off the curb fast enough. Hot ears of corn rolled across the pavement in every direction. The crowd froze and simply watched. The officer wore a look of open contempt on his face. He had no idea that within minutes the very video capturing that slap would shake the entire city to its core. And the most devastating part was not that he would lose his badge. It was the discovery of who that poor corn seller truly was. The city woke slowly that morning, mist still clinging to the tops of the buildings near the train station. Steam rose from vents in the sidewalk, mixing with the smell of coffee drifting out from a corner shop. Nyla Brooks pushed her cart down the same route she had walked for 3 years, her sneakers worn soft at the heels, her gloved hands steady on the handle. She reached her usual corner just as the first commuters began pouring out of the station, briefcases swinging, headphones in, eyes fixed on their phones. She set the brake on her cart, exhaled into the cold air, and got to work the way she always did. She wiped down every ear of corn with a clean cloth before laying it on the grill, taking her time even when a line began to form. She built her coal fire in careful layers, blowing gently until the embers glowed orange and steady. She folded fresh towels beside her seasoning jars, lined up the butter, the chili powder, the lime wedges, everything exactly where her hands expected it to be. When the first customer stepped up, she smiled the way she smiled at everyone, like she had been waiting all morning just for them. Nearby vendors nodded at her as they set up their own carts, and a coffee seller 2 stalls down waved without needing to speak. Office workers from the glass tower across the street always seemed to find their way to her corner. A young accountant named Derek stopped by every Tuesday and Thursday, always ordering the same thing, always leaving an extra $1 in her jar without saying why. A receptionist named Paula liked to talk about her weekend while Nyla turned the corn slowly over the coals. None of them knew much about her beyond her name and her kindness, but that seemed to be enough for everyone who crossed her path. She rarely spoke about herself, and somehow no one ever thought to press her on it. When someone dropped a coin or fumbled with their wallet, she waited without a flicker of impatience, telling them to take their time. When a construction worker once cut in line by mistake, she simply handed him his change first and moved on. No scene, no complaint. She had a way of making the corner feel warmer than the weather allowed, and regulars often said the walk to her cart was the best part of their morning. She told anyone who would listen, in her calm, unhurried voice, that a decent day begins with treating people decently. It was not a lesson she preached. It was simply how she lived. Her apartment, 3 blocks away, held almost nothing extra. A single bed, a small table, a shelf of books with cracked spines, and a framed photograph turned face down in a drawer that nobody had ever seen. She paid her rent on time, kept her utility bills in a neat folder, and never once complained about the cold mornings or the long hours on her feet. Nobody in the neighborhood knew where she had come from before she arrived with that cart 3 years earlier. Nobody asked, and she never offered, and the silence around her past sat there like a locked door nobody thought to knock on. Some evenings, after the cart had been scrubbed clean and the coals had gone cold, she walked home the long way, past the library, past the small park where old men played chess on stone tables. She let herself notice things: a child chasing pigeons, a couple arguing quietly by a bus stop, an old woman feeding stray cats behind the grocery store. She had once lived a life where every hour was scheduled, every meeting logged, every decision weighed against 100 consequences. Now her evenings belonged only to her, and she guarded that simplicity the way other people guarded fortunes. If anyone asked why a woman her age spent winters standing over hot coals instead of resting, she only shrugged and said the work kept her honest. That morning felt no different from 100 others, the smoke curling up into the gray sky, the corn turning gold on the grill, laughter rising from customers who lingered longer than they needed to. Then, without warning, a police cruiser rolled up and stopped directly in front of her cart, its tires bumping against the curb. The engine idled for a long moment before the door swung open. Nyla glanced up, wiped her hands on her apron, and kept working, because in 3 years nothing had ever come from a patrol car stopping nearby. Officer Ryan Mercer stepped out of the vehicle, already irritated before his boots hit the pavement. He had spent the previous hour being dressed down by his lieutenant over a botched report, the kind of humiliation that clung to a man's chest and refused to loosen. His jaw was tight, his eyes scanning the square for anything he could control. He saw the cart tilted slightly onto the edge of the curb, the smoke drifting toward the sidewalk, and decided that was reason enough. He walked straight over, boots striking the pavement hard, and stopped a few feet from the cart. Nyla looked up, expecting the usual nod officers gave her on their rounds. Instead, Ryan's voice came out sharp and clipped, cutting through the morning chatter. "Move this cart now." Nyla wiped her hands again, glanced at the coals still glowing hot beneath the grate, and answered in the same steady tone she used with everyone. She asked for just a few minutes, explaining the coals were still hot, and she didn't want to burn anyone carrying it. It was a reasonable request, spoken without any edge at all. But Ryan had already decided, somewhere between the lieutenant's office and this corner, that he needed someone to listen to him without question. He took her calm as defiance, her patience as an insult, and his voice rose loud enough that heads began turning across the square. People slowed their steps. A woman with a stroller paused near the newsstand. Two men in suits stopped mid-conversation to watch. Ryan's volume climbed further, his finger jabbing toward the cart, words tumbling out about obstruction and disrespect and rules everyone else seemed to follow just fine. Nyla did not raise her voice back. She did not step away either. She simply stood there, hands folded, meeting his anger with a stillness that seemed to make him even angrier, as though her calm was another form of defiance he could not tolerate. The crowd grew thicker by the second, phones beginning to rise from pockets and bags. Derek, the accountant, had just arrived for his Tuesday order and stood frozen near the back of the gathering group. Paula from the glass tower clutched her coffee cup, her knuckles whitening. Nobody said a word out loud, but the tension in the square had turned sharp and metallic, like the seconds before a storm breaks. Ryan's hand curled into a fist, then released, then curled again. He stepped closer, close enough that his shadow fell across her face, and said something low that only she could hear. Nyla did not flinch. She simply held his gaze, waiting for whatever came next the way she had waited through countless difficult mornings in a life nobody around her fully understood. Somewhere behind him, a stranger muttered for him to calm down, but the words seemed to bounce off him without landing, as though his anger had built a wall too thick for reason to pass through. And then, without another word of warning, Ryan raised his hand into the cold autumn air. The slap landed hard across Nyla's face, the sound cracking through the square like a gunshot. Her head snapped sideways, her towel slipping from her shoulder and falling to the pavement. The cart rocked on its wheels, tipping just enough to send a dozen ears of corn tumbling off the grill and rolling across the concrete in every direction. For one long moment, nobody in the crowd made a sound. Then the phones came up, dozens of them, red recording lights blinking to life across the square. Ryan stood over her, chest heaving, and instead of stepping back, instead of realizing what he had just done, he leaned in closer and spat out a word meant to finish what his hand had started, loud enough for the cameras to catch every syllable, adding that people like her never listened. The words hung in the cold air longer than they should have, ugly and unmistakable. Nyla pressed a hand to her cheek for only a second, then let it fall. She did not shout back. She did not cry out for help or plead her case to the strangers filming around her. She knelt down slowly, one knee against the cold pavement, and began gathering the scattered ears of corn one at a time, wiping the dirt from each with the same careful patience she used every morning of her life. Her silence said more than any outburst could have. Near the edge of the gathering, a young woman named Sasha lowered her phone with trembling hands, staring at the video she had just captured. She had been walking to work, running slightly late, and had stopped only because of the shouting. She watched Ryan straighten his jacket and glance around at the crowd as though daring anyone to say something. Her thumb hovered over her screen for a moment before she made her decision and pressed send, releasing the video into the world without knowing exactly what she was about to unleash. An older man nearby offered Nyla his handkerchief, though she waved it away gently and kept working. Ryan lingered a moment longer, perhaps waiting for an apology that would never come, perhaps waiting for the crowd to disperse and take the discomfort with it. Neither happened. Instead, More phones rose around him. More strangers stepped closer, and the silence that had followed the slap slowly filled with the low murmur of disbelief. He finally turned and walked back toward his cruiser, refusing to look at anyone directly. By early afternoon, the video had already crossed from one small circle of friends into a current no one could hold back. It appeared first in group chats, then in local forums, then on every major platform at once, the same 9 seconds looping over and over. The slap, the corn rolling, the ugly word hanging in the cold air. News desks picked it up within hours, cutting between the raw footage and stunned anchors trying to find the right words. A hashtag formed almost overnight, spreading faster than anyone at the police department could track, calling for accountability, calling for answers, calling for the badge number stitched onto Ryan's uniform in that grainy footage. Local television vans began appearing near the square by evening, reporters standing in front of the very corner where the cart had tipped. Strangers who had never met Nyla found themselves defending her, sharing her story, demanding to know her name. At the police department, Ryan sat in the break room scrolling through the same video everyone else was watching, his jaw tight, his leg bouncing under the table. He told himself it would blow over, the way so many things seemed to pass after a few days of noise, muttering it to another officer who only offered a tight, uncomfortable nod and kept walking. By the next morning, more officers found reasons to avoid the break room whenever Ryan sat down. Conversations quieted when he entered a room, then picked back up once he left. His lieutenant called him in for a private conversation that left Ryan's face pale, though he emerged from the office still repeating the same defense. He was doing his job, as though repetition alone could make it true. Within 48 hours, the department announced an internal investigation, and Ryan's badge, though not yet revoked, suddenly felt heavier on his chest than it ever had before. Reporters began calling the precinct directly, and a spokesperson was assigned to handle the flood of requests. Community groups organized a gathering outside the station, holding signs showing a still frame from the video, the corn scattered across the pavement, Nyla's hand pressed to her cheek. Ryan watched the coverage from his car one evening, unwilling to walk past the small crowd of protesters gathered near his building. He told himself repeatedly that context mattered, that a single bad moment should not define a decade of service. But some quieter part of him had already begun to suspect that no explanation would undo what the footage had shown the world. Then, on the third day, something happened he had not expected at all. A man in a tailored gray coat walked into the small coffee shop near the square and asked quietly where he might find the woman who sold corn on the corner. Attorney Malcolm Rhodes had not planned on visiting the city that week, but the video had reached him the same way it reached everyone else, through a screen, through a jolt of recognition that struck him like a physical blow. He watched it 3 times before he was certain, before the years fell away and he saw past the gray in her hair and the weight of exhaustion in her shoulders. He knew that face. He had known it for over 20 years, back when they had both fought battles that most people in the city had long since forgotten. He found her sitting on an overturned crate near her damaged cart, taping the wheel back into place. She looked up at him, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. Then Malcolm sat down across from her on the curb, exactly the way he used to sit across from her at meetings decades earlier. 2 old friends reunited by the worst possible circumstance. Slowly, pieces of a story began to surface that no one in the city had ever heard before. Years before she ever touched a cart or lit a single coal, Nyla Brooks had been a name spoken with respect in rooms most people never entered. She had organized housing programs for families on the edge of losing everything, had sat across tables from officials twice her age, and refused to back down when they tried to dismiss her. She had spent a decade building bridges between struggling neighborhoods and the resources they had always been denied, working nights and weekends without ever asking for recognition. When she finally stepped back from that world, she did not vanish out of shame or defeat. She stepped back because she wanted, for the first time in her adult life, to build something small and honest with her own 2 hands. Malcolm remembered the exhaustion in her eyes near the end of those years, the toll it had taken to fight the same battles again and again with little to show beyond incremental progress. He remembered the farewell dinner colleagues had thrown for her, how she had thanked everyone but revealed nothing of what she planned to do next. None of them had imagined she would choose a street corner and a cart of corn, trading conference rooms for open air, trading committees for quiet mornings that belonged to no one but her. He leaned forward and asked the question that had been sitting on his tongue since he first saw the video. Was it time for people to know the truth? Nyla only smiled, the same small, knowing smile she had always given him whenever he pushed too hard toward an answer she wasn't ready to give. She looked out across the square at the faint marks still visible on the pavement where the corn had scattered. Malcolm did not press further. He simply reached into his coat, pulled out his phone, and made a call that set something larger into motion. Within a day, he arrived at the courthouse carrying a thick folder of documents nobody had thought to ask for, records that were about to change everything. The internal investigation moved faster once security footage was pulled from every angle around the square. Camera feeds from the train station, the coffee shop, the bank across the street. Each recording told the same story from a different position, and none of them supported the account Ryan had written in his official statement. He had claimed she resisted a lawful order, that she pushed him first, that his response had been necessary and controlled. The footage showed none of that. It showed her hands folded, her stillness, and his hand rising in the cold autumn air with nothing behind it but rage. Detectives compared his written statement against his verbal account given hours later, and the two no longer matched in several key details. Every piece of evidence chipped away at the version of events Ryan had built until almost nothing of his story remained standing. Reporters obtained portions of the investigation through public records requests, and each new detail became its own headline. Newspapers ran side-by-side comparisons of his statement against the footage. Legal analysts broke down each contradiction on evening broadcasts, while former officers spoke anonymously about a culture where reports were sometimes shaped to protect a colleague rather than reflect the truth. Civil rights organizations demanded a broader look at how complaints against officers had been handled in years past. The pressure built steadily until it reached the office of the one person in the city whose voice could not be ignored. Mayor Denise Holloway called a press conference on a gray Thursday afternoon, television cameras crowding the steps of City Hall. She spoke carefully at first, acknowledging the investigation, promising transparency. But then, unexpectedly, she said something no one in the crowd anticipated. She knew the woman in that video personally, and the city owed her far more than an apology. The room fell silent as she stepped down from the podium and walked directly toward Nyla, who had been quietly standing near the back of the gathered crowd. The mayor did not shake her hand. She wrapped her arms around her instead, in front of every camera, every reporter scribbling furiously into their notebooks. The image would be printed on front pages by the next morning. Two women embracing outside City Hall, one in a tailored suit, the other still wearing her worn apron dusted faintly with cornmeal. What the mayor said next changed the way the entire city understood the woman they had only recently learned to recognize. Years earlier, long before City Hall knew her name attached to any title, Nyla had quietly founded a community fund that helped thousands of struggling families find steady work and launch small businesses of their own. She had built it from nothing, refusing every offer of public recognition, declining awards, avoiding cameras, insisting the credit belonged to the families doing the work of rebuilding their own lives. When the fund had grown large enough to run without her, she had simply stepped away and let it continue, disappearing into an ordinary life that suited her far better than any spotlight ever could. The square fell into a stunned, heavy silence. Somewhere near the back of the crowd, Ryan Mercer stood frozen, his face drained of color, the weight of what he had done finally landing on him in full. He had struck a woman he believed to be powerless, judged in a single glance, and decided she did not deserve patience or respect. Instead, he had struck someone who had quietly reshaped thousands of lives, and the entire city now knew it in the same breath they learned his name. Strangers who had walked past Nyla's cart 100 times without a second glance now found themselves recalculating everything they thought they understood about the woman behind the grill. Some felt embarrassed, remembering moments they had barely nodded at her. Others felt something closer to shame, recalling the silence they had kept during the encounter itself, raising their phones instead of their voices. A local business owner who had once complained about her cart blocking foot traffic quietly deleted his old comments online. The mayor's words had forced an entire square full of people to examine how easily they had overlooked someone standing right in front of them. The formal hearing was scheduled within the week, and by the time it began, the courtroom overflowed with more spectators than the building could comfortably hold. Television crews lined the hallway outside, broadcasting the proceedings live to a city that had not looked away from this story in days. Inside, Ryan sat at the defense table in a stiff gray suit that did nothing to soften the exhaustion carved into his face. Across from him, Malcolm arranged his files with the calm precision of a man who had waited a long time for a moment exactly like this one. The questioning began methodically. Malcolm played the footage first, the same 9 seconds the entire city had already memorized, now paired with additional angles that left no room for interpretation. He followed it with traffic camera recordings, bank security footage, and written statements from 6 separate witnesses. Each piece landed like another brick against a wall, quickly becoming impossible to climb. One witness, an elderly man who had sold newspapers near the same corner for over 20 years, testified about Nyla's calm and Ryan's anger building long before the slap ever came. When asked why he had come forward, the old man simply said he had watched that woman treat every person on that corner with respect for years, and it was time someone returned the favor. Ryan's own attorney attempted to argue provocation, attempted to suggest that stress and department pressure had clouded his judgment in a single unfortunate moment. But every question Malcolm asked in return dismantled that argument piece by piece, until Ryan sat there with nothing left to offer but silence. When finally asked directly whether he believed his actions were justified, Ryan opened his mouth to answer and found no words waiting there at all. Judge Camille Whitmore listened through every hour of testimony without a single visible flicker of emotion. When it came time to deliver her ruling, she spoke slowly, her voice carrying to every corner of the packed room without needing to rise. She said that no uniform, no badge, no title granted any person the right to place their hands on another human being out of anger or convenience. She said the law existed to protect the vulnerable from exactly this kind of abuse, not to shield those who committed it while wearing it. She reminded the courtroom that authority without accountability was no authority at all. Then, without additional ceremony, she ordered that his badge be surrendered on the spot, right there in the courtroom in front of everyone who had gathered to witness the outcome. 2 officers stepped forward to formally collect it. Ryan's hands trembled as he unpinned the metal shield from his chest, the same shield he had worn like armor for over a decade, the same shield that had somehow convinced him he stood above the very people he was meant to serve. He placed it into the officer's waiting palm without meeting anyone's eyes, his shoulders curling inward. The courtroom did not erupt into applause or shouting. It simply sat in silence, watching a man lose the only identity he had built his entire life around. In the days that followed, Ryan's life unraveled. The department terminated him formally within a week, and word of the case spread quickly enough that no other precinct in the region would consider his application. Neighbors who once waved to him now crossed the street to avoid conversation, and old friends stopped returning his calls one by one. He applied for work at a security firm, then a warehouse, then a rental car counter near the airport, and each time the interview ended the moment his name registered on the other side of the desk. He stopped watching the news entirely, unable to bear seeing his own face beside a headline he already knew by heart. His mother called once a week, her voice careful and searching, never quite finding the right question to ask a son she barely recognized anymore. Late at night, he would sometimes drive past the square without meaning to, slowing near the corner where the cart still stood, though he never once found the courage to stop the car. Meanwhile, across town, something entirely different was unfolding at the corner near the train station. Word of who Nyla truly was had spread through every neighborhood, carried by the same speed that had once spread the video of her being struck. Now people lined up at her cart, not out of curiosity, but out of something closer to reverence, waiting patiently even when the line stretched halfway down the block. They came because they finally understood the quiet strength that had always stood behind her calm expression, and they wanted, in their own small way, to honor it. City officials proposed expanding the community fund she had built years earlier, offering to attach her name to it formally. Reporters lined up requesting interviews. Publishers offered to help her tell her story to a wider audience than she had ever imagined. She turned down every personal donation, insisting that any support belonged to the families the fund was meant to serve. All she ever asked in return was that people simply try to treat one another with a little more kindness. She kept the cart in the same spot, refusing offers to relocate her to a storefront with her name painted across the window. Derek still came by every Tuesday and Thursday, though now he had to arrive earlier to beat the growing line. Paula brought her co-workers from the glass tower on Fridays, treating the walk to the corner as something closer to a small pilgrimage than a coffee break. Nyla noticed the added weight in how people looked at her now, and tried in her quiet way to remind them that nothing about her had actually changed. She was still the same woman who wiped down every ear of corn before it touched the grill, still the same woman who folded towels the same way every morning. Weeks passed, the city slowly returning to its usual rhythm, though something in the air near that corner had shifted permanently. Then, on a cold afternoon much like the one that started everything, a familiar figure appeared at the edge of the square, walking slowly, hands buried deep in his coat pockets. Ryan stood there for a long moment before finally approaching the cart, his steps hesitant, his eyes fixed on the ground. He stopped a few feet away, the same distance he had stood on that terrible afternoon weeks earlier, though everything about him seemed different now. His shoulders had lost their old rigidity. His voice, when it finally came, barely rose above the sound of the wind. He lowered his head and told her plainly that he was sorry, not the hollow apology he had once offered to a camera, but something raw and unfiltered that seemed to cost him everything to say out loud. For the first time in his life, he understood that the weight of a badge had never come from the power it granted him. It had come from the responsibility he had been trusted to carry, a responsibility he had thrown away in a single careless moment. Nyla said nothing for a long while, studying his face the way she studied everyone who approached her cart, searching for something honest beneath the surface. Finally, she reached down, selected an ear of corn still warm from the coals, and held it out to him without a word of judgment attached to the gesture. Ryan stared at it for a moment before accepting it with both hands, as though it weighed far more than it should have. "Everyone makes mistakes," she told him, her voice as steady as it had always been, carrying none of the anger he had braced himself to receive. "What matters is who you choose to become after." The words settled over him quietly, without any performance behind them, exactly the way she had lived her entire life. Ryan's eyes filled, and for the first time since that terrible afternoon, he let himself feel the full weight of everything he had lost, and everything he might still be able to rebuild. He turned and walked away slowly, the warm corn still cupped in his hands, disappearing into the flow of the crowd moving through the square. A few onlookers who had gathered near the edge of the cart exchanged glances, unsure whether it counted as forgiveness or simply the first small step toward it. Nyla did not explain herself to any of them, and none of them asked. She had never needed an audience to know what she believed, and she did not need one now to prove it. She watched him go for a moment before turning back to her grill, laying another ear of corn carefully across the coals, the smoke curling upward into the cold afternoon sky, exactly as it had every single day before. The cart remained right there on the corner, unmoved, unshaken, a fixed point in a city that had learned something about itself it would not soon forget. People continued to stop throughout the afternoon, drawn by the familiar smell of roasted corn drifting across the square. Some regulars, some strangers who had only recently learned her name. They came not only for the taste, though the taste remained as good as it had always been, but for something harder to name, something they carried with them long after they walked away. Months later, when the noise of the story had finally quieted and the city had moved on to other headlines, the corner still held the same rhythm it always had. Nyla still arrived before sunrise, still lit her coals the same careful way, still smiled at every stranger the way she had always smiled at everyone. Somewhere across town, Ryan had taken a job stocking shelves at a hardware store, small and unremarkable, the kind of work that asked nothing of him but honesty and effort. He never became a regular at her cart, but every few weeks he found his way back to that corner, always keeping a respectful distance, always leaving without saying much. It was enough, it seemed, simply to remember what he had learned there, and to try, one ordinary day at a time, to become someone worthy of it. They remembered, in that quiet corner of the city, that kindness had outlasted cruelty, that patience had outweighed power, and that dignity, in the end, had never needed a title to prove itself real. Status might make people fear you for a moment, but only fairness and compassion can earn their respect for a lifetime.